Why? That is the purpose and meaning. That is our call. So Paul says, listen, don't be a taker, be a giver. But the only way you can be a giver is if you're a good worker. And so that's the pattern that we see all through Scripture. Here's another one, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9. Paul said the example. He says, listen, I'm not just preaching to the choir. I'm not just telling y'all to do something that I'm not willing to do myself. Notice what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9. He says, I'm the example. He says, surely you guys remember, brothers and sisters, our toil, our hardship, that we work day and night in order not to be a burden to anyone. Here's what Paul is saying. I took the plow up 6 days a week before I stepped in the pulpit on Sunday. He said, it's plow before the pulpit. Plow before the pulpit. Why? He says, I want to be a great example and a great model of someone who's not just a taker, but I'm also a giver. So he says, you know, our toil and our hardship, we work night and day in order to not be a burden to anyone while we preach the gospel of God to everyone. Let me just tell you, the gospel is not carried with lazy hands, folks. Paul is saying, listen, the gospel isn't carried with lazy hands. When we show up at the office, we need to be there for a reason and a purpose, to honor and glorify God, to earn something that I can share with others, to be an example of what it truly means to be a Christ follower, and the idea of work, which leads me to worship. Work, which leads me to worship. Here's the last one I'll read before we jump into this acrostic I want to give you. So here's this. Colossians chapter 3, I love these words. You might want to memorize these. Whatever you do, everybody say whatever. A word whatever, look at this written language, it means whatever. I listed 10 top jobs a few minutes ago. If you do one of those jobs, great. That's part of the whatever. I listed some of the things I've done over the years, what Gina did, or whatever you do. Whatever you do, work at it with all of your heart. That means be diligent in your work as working for the Lord. He says, listen, if we understand Christ as our boss, man, excellence is always the only option. So he says, not for human masters. He says, every one of us has a boss. You have bosses, I have bosses. My bosses are called elders and deacons, right? You have bosses wherever you are. So we all have a boss, but he says, listen, that's not our mindset. He says, we don't work for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is Christ whom you are serving. So he's saying, hey, we need a reset about work. That whatever you do, or whatever you're doing, whether it's considered white collar, blue collar, whether it's your own job or your own company, understand you're not just working for your human boss. You're ultimately working for the Lord. And I will submit to you a little further along the line that whatever you do, if it's a legit work and legit business, it's just as sacred as what I'm doing. I want you to hear me. It is just as sacred as what I'm doing. The Latin word vocation comes from the Latin word vocare, which means to call. It is the call to salvation, and it is the call to work. See, something happened in the medieval period as the monks and the monasteries were beginning to grow, and the priesthood within the church at the time, the Catholic Church at the time, was beginning to grow. This word vocare, this Latin word vocare, was kind of stolen from the people. And all of a sudden, that word vocare, which simply means calling, and it was used all the time, talking about calling to salvation, then calling to doing what God has called you to do. The priests and the monks begin to save that up. And they begin to say, wait. What we do for God, even if all I do is go to the highest mountain no one could go to, and I go in this monastery and live my life separated from people, or if I'm a priest here, they said, listen, that is a vocare. That is a calling. That is sacred. Everything else is sacred. Can I tell you, that was never the way God had it planned? Then the Reformation comes along. And a guy named Martin Luther began to understand, listen, the plumber is just as sacred as the priest. And I love what Martin Luther did. He basically took that word vocare, took it away from the church, baptized it in the truth, and gave it back to the people. And he tried to say, listen, what you do, whatever you do, whatever your vocation is, it is just as sacred as what the priest or the monk does. I'll read you a couple of Martin Luther quotes. He says, the plowboy and the preacher both serve God when they work faithfully in their stations. He says, listen, whether you're a plowboy or a preacher, we both serve God when we are faithful in our stations. Here's another one Luther said. The works of monks and priests, however holy and arduous they may be, do not differ one whit in the sight of God from the works of the rustic laborer in the field. Did you get that? He says, regardless of how the priests operate and the monks operate, he goes, if fulfilled correctly and done correctly, the plowboy, the worker in the field, the rustic laborer in the field, his job is just as sacred in God's eyes as the priest or the preacher or anyone else. So, child of God, first thing I want you to understand about your work's sacred. Okay, now if it's illegal, probably not so much. All right? If it is a legal, legitimate job, all right, then we'll say it's sacred. If it's illegal, I'm going to say find another career, all right? Find another career. So, what I thought I'd do today, boy, you think about all these passages, that they're all Christianized, man. Don't ever let someone say, you know what, don't ever sit there. Now, my guess is I've been your pastor for a long time. You don't sit there and go, boy, he's so sacred. My job is just like your job. I just have a different vocabulary. My calling is to preach God's word to you. But you have the same vocabulary, the same vocation, the same sanctified calling to whether it's accounting or finance or sales or whatever you do. That is sacred to the Lord. All right, so let me just, I thought I'd do this. Let me just give you an acrostic for word. You've heard the foundation. God set the pattern, God set the rhythm. Then we want to work and then we want to worship. We want to work, we want to worship. Whatever you do can be holy to the Lord. The sermon you preach to the world is Monday through Friday at the office. Then also the sermon is making worship a priority. So thought number one, just going to give you an acrostic. Hopefully you have this in your app. I have a lot of verses that I can't get to. Thought number one, the W for the acrostic and word is worship while you work. Okay? Yes, we are worshiping today. We're worshiping in God's house. We're worshiping in the church. But I want you to know, when you go into the office tomorrow, that also is worship. You say, where do you see that? Look at it in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. He says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, I love this over and over again, whatever you do, whether you're in the boardroom, the classroom, the workshop, or the kitchen, whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. So if you think about whatever you do, wherever you head into the office tomorrow, just think, I am doing this for the glory of God. So my work is where I worship, not just the church. And so here, if you walk in and understand that I'm going into my office for the glory of God, every cubicle can become a cathedral. Do you got it? Wherever you go, wherever you journey, whatever your office looks like, every cubicle, every office can be a cathedral or a church. Why? Because you understand that your work is your worship. I love the Old Testament. Exodus chapter 31, you can go read it this afternoon if you want to. It's the children of God had gone to the promised land, and all of a sudden as they went to the promised land, the spies ended up turning around and meandered around the desert for 40 years, and God said, you know what, I need to give you a place that y'all can worship me. And they hadn't gotten into the promised land, so it wasn't time for the temple, it was time for the tabernacle. Tabernacle was this tent-like structure that could be lifted up and moved, but it was supposed to be the place, the forerunner of the temple, which is ultimately the forerunner of the church, the place where you go to meet God. And so in Exodus chapter 31, God says to Moses, he says, listen, there's a guy named Bezalel who's in the camp. And God says, Moses, I want him to build the tabernacle. My spirit has filled him, and I call him, and I have gifted him to do what? To basically be a project manager. He says he's good with stone, he's good with iron, he's good with wood, he's good with metal, he's good with everything. What was to do? He was simply a general manager for the construction of the tabernacle, but God says, I gave him those gifts. The Spirit I gave him. So I want you to understand that if you are a craftsman, if you are a salesman, if you are an accountant, if you are in finance, if you are whatever you are, God has given you those gifts. Honor that calling. See, God could have said, Moses, you're the leader of the children of Israel. I have Aaron, the priest, and the priesthood. Let them do all the work. He said, no. Moses, you're good at walking around the desert and talking to trees that are on fire. All right? Aaron is good at sacrifices, but Aaron is terrible at building things, right? Mm-hmm. You ever known someone that just seems like put a tool in their hand, they know how to use it, right? And if you're like me, you're like, that's just dangerous for everybody around, right? We don't need power tools in my hand. But God looked at this guy that was kind of a nobody. If you look at the kingdom of things, he wasn't Moses, he wasn't Aaron, he was just a dude who was good with stone and wood and metals, and God said, I want him to build my tabernacle. And God says, and my Spirit has gifted him with that ability. So whatever you do, understand worship while you work. Here's the oath. Offer your work to God. Whatever you do, offer it to God. Here it is in the Old Testament. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 3. It says, commit to the Lord whatever you do. You might want to underline that or make a note of it if you have the app open. That word commit is the Hebrew word that means roll. That I want to take whatever I do and I want to roll it to God. And say, God, this is how I'm